All right, well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. Super excited to have you all. GrowthBook's hosting this webinar with myself and Ronny Kohavi. We're going to be talking about a couple different topics focused on designing experiments for long-term growth. Um, I'll let Ronnie introduce himself, but many of you know Ronnie is a leader in the experimentation space, ex-VP and technical fellow at Airbnb, Microsoft, and Amazon, and I'm the head of experimentation at GrowthBook. And yeah, without further ado, I think we'll get started. As a reminder, what we're going to be doing during today's webinar is raffling off 3 tickets to Ronnie's class, Accelerating Innovation with A/B Testing. You've got to be present at the Q&A, so at the end of the webinar session to win. The next cohort for that class is running starting March 9th, but there will be a later one that you could also maybe defer your ticket to, or maybe transfer it to another person at your company who might be better suited if you are a winner. But yeah, stick around for that. We'll be running the raffle at the end of the webinar before the Q&A. So we'll do some brief intros. Then Ronnie's going to talk about the importance of experimentation, and then an interesting topic around what to do in the situation of, flat treatments, shipping flat treatments, and online controlled experiments. I'll talk a little bit about short-term measurement and long-term goals, and then we'll open up to the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, Ronnie, I'm going to toss it over to you. You're sharing your OneNote right now. There you go. You're also muted, my guy.
Okay, I'm up. Hopefully you can see the screen.
All good.
All good. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my biases. I got PhD in machine learning from Stanford. I then went to Amazon, director of data mining and personalization. And one of my teams was Web Lab, which is the Amazon experimentation system. I then went to Microsoft for almost 15 years, technical fellow and core VP, led the analysis and experimentation team, which is pretty large scale. We were launching about 100 new treatments every workday, and the scale continued. They're now at about 300. I then went to Airbnb, led the relevance, personalization, and experimentation. I think many of you might know I wrote this, co-authored the Hippo book, which has been translated into a bunch of languages, and I'm now consulting and teaching. So I want to start with a few words about why experiments are important, and hopefully convince you that this is one of those things that you should use regularly and be humbled by. So first of all, in science, randomized controlled experiments are the gold standard. There's nothing sort of higher in what's called a hierarchy of evidence to give you evidence that something has an effect. A/B tests are basically a synonym for online randomized controlled experiments. So this is something that we don't do, in medicine, they're called randomized clinical trials. Online, we call them A/B tests. And I think this is one of the key observations, which is we are very poor at assessing the value of ideas. So here's a bunch of rows with estimates of success rate of experiments. So at Microsoft, when we started, before we ran an experiment, there's a lot of work to try and get it right. And we had what in this table is the highest success rate, but we paid for it, right? If you go down, Avinash Kaushik has talked about a 20% success rate. I worked at Bing, where we were launching a lot of ideas with, trying to improve the search engine, and our success rate was about 15%. At Booking, at Google Ads, at Netflix, these are all around 10%. And then I also led Airbnb search, and I was allowed to disclose that our success rate of trying these machine learning models and UI to improve search was about 8%. So very, very humbling reality. Most of the things we try don't move the metrics that we are trying to improve. When you have an estimate of the success rate, you can compute a critical metric called FPR, okay, which is the false positive risk. That is the probability that when you get a statistically significant result, so the tool says you won under the standard, metric of alpha 0.05, meaning if you get a p-value less than 0.05 and 80% power, meaning well-run experiments, high power, you are going to be mistaken this percentage of the time. So think about this. This is like the median at 10%, where most people should find themselves. When you have a statistically significant result, 22% of the time, it will be a false positive. The actual effect will be not statistically significant. So I think it's something key to remember as we talk about ideas. A lot of people think, oh, we're running with 0.05 as a threshold. We rarely make mistakes. No, you are going to make a lot of mistakes because the metric that we really care about is FPR. In order to compute that, you need the success rate. I want to show you just share some surprising experiments in brief. At Microsoft Bing, we had this simple UI change that was worth $120 million, but it's sat in the backlog for months because nobody thought it was valuable. That example opens up my book, and I open my class with the details. But for you, just think about the fact that something was lying there for months in the backlog. At Airbnb, the biggest experimental win was a one-line code change. At Google, they played with optimizing the color scheme, and it was worth $200 million annually. So we have certainly surprising experiments that we don't know how to value a priori, and we need experiments, A/B tests, to tell us the true value, and then realign the backlog based on what we learn. When you look at sort of the long-term value of an experimentation system, you see that we have several types of metrics. We have what we call success metrics or goal metrics, which are very high level. Why does the organization or product exist? What does success look like? But the problem is they're not easy to measure, right? If you think about something like stock price, some executives will have goals around market cap, market share, or stock price. You can't run an experiment and measure the stock price, right? Too high variability, too delayed, not relevant. So we come up with driver metrics, sometimes called surrogates or predictive metrics. They are much more shorter term, and they are more sensitive. We believe that if we move them, we actually get a strong signal that we're moving in the right direction. And so one of the things that you have to think about as an organization is creating some OEC, an overall evaluation criterion, or it could be a small set of criteria that is typically composed of these success or driver metrics. I want to give you an example. I worked at Bing, but this applies to Google or other search engines. We typically evaluate ourselves long-term on query share. How many distinct queries do we get out of the whole market? And then, of course, revenue. So these are our long-term goals. They're hard to measure in the short term. You can't run an experiment and say, what is my query share? But because it's distinct query, there's a question, should you just set that as the OEC? Like if we can increase the number of queries that users do, would that be good enough? And it turns out, I like this example because the answer is, wow, no, this would be a mistake, right? So a key example, we had a ranking bug in the ranker, and it showed very poor results, right? You would type something and you would get really shitty results. But what happened is the queries per user improved. It looks like people are issuing more queries, right? Because we're showing poor results, so they sort of reframe it, add a word, do things. And then revenue went up a lot. Why? Because the algorithmic results for this ranker are poor, and then the ads suddenly look a lot better. So it looks like we're making more money, right? So if you really went with this OEC of saying, distinct queries, you'd fire the relevance team, right? Let's just degrade stuff and we'll make more money and we'll increase query share. Well, obviously that's not correct. But if you ever go and interview, the story is now in this book called Data Science Interviews Exposed, where they ask you to explain what's going on. So I'll give you some idea of what's going on here, which is what we would like to do is decompose the queries per month, right? This measure of distinct queries as queries per session times sessions per user times users per month, right? And I've done nothing fancy here in terms of math. If you look out, the sessions cancels out, the users cancel out, and I end up with queries per month. Okay, so the key observation is that we want users to find answers and complete their tasks quickly. And therefore, this metric, the queries per session, should be minimized. Whereas sessions per user is something that should be maximized. Right? And this is very appealing because it shows you repeat usage. That's like the holy grail. I get people to come and visit me more. I must be doing something well. Now, in a controlled experiment, you typically send approximately the same number of users to by design, say 50-50 or a third, a third, a third. So this factor turns out to be the same for the control and any of the treatments. So really interesting observation about how to form your OEC. You want to maximize this term, whereas you want to maximize that term. In reality, Bing sort of has multiple metrics. We, of course, look at sessions per user and queries per user per session that I just mentioned, but we also look at the time to success, right? How long does it take you to click on something where you don't click back? And just as a Boolean, and of course, revenue per user. So we do form an OEC that is made out of multiple metrics. Now, the trade-off that you have between revenue and measures of user satisfaction, that's a key business decision. We know we can add ads and generate more revenue, but we know that it hurts the key metrics. I want to give you another example of user satisfaction because that's sort of a key thing for your OEC. If you're at a booking site, I worked at Airbnb, there's bookings, Expedia, Vrbo. You care about conversion rates, but you also care about satisfaction, right? Are users booking something that they'll be happy with, right? If I can convert a user today, but when they actually stay and they rate it as a 2-star stay, then they're not coming back, right? So the OEC should be some measure of booking, but it also includes some measure of satisfaction, like the user rating. And the key idea here is that you have historical data. So you can build machine learning models that predict whether this user is going to rate us as 5 stars when they stay 3 months later. And we can make that part of the OEC. So we're not necessarily optimizing for just conversion. We're estimating if the user is going to be converting to a listing that they are going to love and rate 5 stars, for example. That's a trade-off that you're going to make as a business, and it's a tough one. Right? You can turn that knob and say, I care more about satisfaction. You will get less bookings. So we're going to now make a few assumptions, and then I'll take you through one of the most interesting decisions that I see out there for long-term, which is shipping on flat results. So first of all, we're going to assume that the organization agrees on some OEC, some overall evaluation criteria, ideally a single metric, typically a combination of multiple metrics that are weighed somehow. And our goal is to improve the OEC. And I want to mention in advance, there are valid scenarios where the goal isn't to improve the OEC, but to have sort of non-inferiority, right? You don't want to degrade something. For example, if you refactor code, you're making maintenance easy, but you don't want to degrade the OEC. You don't necessarily want to improve it. Or if you make some infrastructure replacement, you take a library from a vendor. Goal isn't necessarily to, ideally you would improve, but you're happy if you replace the library, everything is good, you got new functionality, but you didn't degrade. Compliance happens a lot, right? GDPR, CCPA in California, there may be legal reasons why you have to do something, and you want to sort of ideally end up with non-inferiority, or sometimes your goal is to hurt the least in terms of the OEC. And then competitive parity. Sometimes it's important to be, to get this check mark on some comparison that's coming out by third-party tools. So now let's talk about this critical question of, you have a result from an experiment and it's flat, meaning it didn't statistically significantly improve the OEC, right? So I believe it's a key decision error to ship on flat in most cases. And then flat, again, is defined as, I did not get a statistically significant result, but I really like it. Okay, and love this Feynman quote. First principle is, you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So I'm going to give you an example and review common reasons why people say shipping on flat is reasonable, and then why I believe they're mostly incorrect, right? So except for the exceptions that I shared in the previous slide, I think I'll go through some of the reasons why people say we should ship and why this is mostly wrong. So I'll give you an example. I was at Bing, we introduced the third pane, right? We have the central pane, the middle pane, that's usually on the right these days, where they give you like Wikipedia answers or other thing. And then we wanted to show a third pane with, at the time, it was like social integration. It was a major effort. Multiple engineers, I kid you not, like it's like 100 engineers working on it for 6 months. And everything we tried to add in that third plane fails to show value. But it was strategic. It was a canvas for innovation. And then we ended up shipping it. It took us a whole year and countless additional experiments where nothing showed value, and we rolled it back at significant costs. Right? We're talking about 100 engineers working on this idea for a year. You can just imagine the cost of this. We could have failed faster if it were not the fact that we were committed to this like new canvas as a strategic move and an innovation surface. So let me now give you reasons where people say we should ship flat, right? And they sound, reasonable. I'll tell you why I don't believe them. So first of all, okay, we're not really hurting, right? It's flat. It's not stat sig worse. It's flat. So technically, we have this null hypothesis that allows us to only reject the null, meaning we can only say if something was with a low p-value significantly different than the control, right? This is the classical thing, but we cannot accept the null, right? So this is very important observation. You can reject the null and say, I've seen a statistically significant result. You can never accept the null that there is no treatment effect. It could very well be that the test is what's called underpowered, doesn't have enough power. So all you can say is that with some probability, it is not bigger than some number, which we typically call the MDE, the minimum detectable effect. And based on how powerful your experiment is, based on how many users you have and the variance of things, there's a power formula that can tell you what types of MDE you can detect. But it's just possible you're underpowered. And that's the problem that I'm describing above is exacerbated when the first iteration is like negative. And then people tweak it and run again and iterate a few times until they have a non-stat sig iteration, right? So it was negative, and then on the third or fourth iteration, we managed to get not stat sig. And people say, okay, now let's ship it. Bad idea. Okay, this is a great cartoon example of an underpowered studies in this book called Cartoon Guide to Statistics, where, factories were discharging chemicals into waterways, and the law said you have to show that the result is not statistically significantly worse. And so the polluter, they know they're violating the standards, says, oh, we're just going to measure it on a few ducks, right? Small sample size, it will never be statistically significant. Second reason, I hear this a lot, team morale. My God, the team worked on this feature for months. The spec was so motivated. People were staying nights and weekends to finish it on schedule. How could we not ship it? I believe the culture should be results-oriented and just recognize that many ideas fail, and there's just another one that we failed on. Because if you ship and you celebrate the ship, most people are going to see through it. Who are you fooling other than your own organization? Now, it's still reasonable to hold an end of the project event, to share the learnings. We said, look, we implemented this idea. We thought it would work. It's flat, but we're not going to ship it. We're not going to complicate the code base. We're going to pay for this in maintenance costs. Now, we can decide if to iterate or to move on to the next idea, given the data. This is sort of the key sort of CIO question, right? Do you celebrate, do you iterate, or do you obliterate? But this reason of team morale, I think, is low value. Third reason that I hear a lot, it's an enabler. Once we ship the feature, we could build this really successful other feature on top of it. So we need it as an enabler. It's a powerful argument. I've heard it a lot, and it boils down to engineering cost, right? The question that I always want to ask is, if we were to ship this to 100%, and the reason is we wouldn't need to maintain the old version, would it really be something that would never roll back, right? This is sort of a one-way door. Once we deprecate the old version, once we stop maintaining it, would we not roll back? And the answer a lot of times is no. This is additional code. Why would we, take this new like third pane that I showed you and maintain it and do stuff if there's a possibility that when we don't see the things on top of it generate value, that we will roll it back? And that's what happened to us at Bing. We did roll back. It's very easy to believe or hope that if we only make this large change, we'll be on some higher mountain, we can climb higher. Right? But sadly, the reality is that most of these major launches that build a lot of new infrastructure or change some things or do a redesign, they fail to live up to the expectations. It takes a long time if you do a big jump and change a lot to sort of move to a place where you can be higher than where you were today, and the costs are humongous. Just want to clarify, there was a question saying what does shipping flat mean? I hope I've explained it. It means basically that you run a controlled experiment and it was not statistically significantly better or worse, but worse is no problem. It was not statistically significantly better. Okay, so the question is, the math, the science tells you you're not improving with high probability. What do you do with this piece of code? It's called flat. Do you ship it or do you not ship it? Reason 4, the change is strategic. The CEO's involved. We have to show progress. They told us it's a goal, but the data is very clear. It is very hard to correctly predict success, right? I showed you earlier, right? Most of experiments fail. So why would this sort of a big launch really work? And, I have a link here if you're interested. Lots of major redesigns fail spectacularly. My recommendation is set a vision, but move towards the vision slowly, right? Don't try to change 17 things for 6 months. After 6 months of work, test one factor at a time. And we've done that. And I remember at Amazon, we were very good at saying, this is the long vision, but we're going to try to move towards it in steps. And boy, we course correct over time. Okay, as you get additional data, adjust the vision. So this is sort of my brief part. One thing to say, if you want to learn more, I teach online courses on Maven. There's a flagship class, Accelerate Innovation, with A/B testing, 5 sessions, 2.5 hours each. If you're in this webinar and you want to attend the class, there's a URL here, which I'll put in the chat. Oh, sorry, wrong URL here. I got to get this one, which will allow you to get a discount. Okay, that's the right one. And then there's also an advanced topics. I encourage you to attend the flagship class unless you're really good at A/B testing. These are fairly advanced topics. And, the most common thing I hear from people that joined them without taking the basic class is, I wish I took the flagship class. So if you want to join, these are 2 URLs that you can use to join these classes. And this starts next week, and this starts in 3 weeks. That is it for my part. Luke, you're up.
Thank you, thank you. Just a reminder, we'll be running the Q&A through Slido. We're seeing some good questions coming in the Zoom Q&A, but please head over to slido.com and go to this number or use the QR code to ask your questions in there. Thank you. That'll help us kind of share it with everybody and pick the questions we need to answer in the Q&A session. Thanks, Ronnie. Let me make sure I got this lined up. Great. So, a lot of what Ronnie just talked about is based on the case where you have that clear overall evaluation criteria that you've built, or you have one that you can kind of ask these questions about what to do in these flat situations, flat when you have flat results. I'm going to talk a little bit about that first part that Ronnie was talking about, which is relating short-term measurement to your long-term goals, how different teams have done this in the past, and talk a little bit about my experience as well. So just again, some of my background, I'm GrowthBook's head of experimentation. I previously worked on platform teams at both Meta and Twitter. On Twitter's experimentation data science team, I was working on expanding the platform functionality and developing team measurement strategies around holdouts and shipping criteria and stuff like that. And I also worked at Meta, kind of validating ground truth measurement strategies, which is a topic that will come up a little bit here in terms of evaluating maybe these estimated OECs, some related work that's come out of Meta as well. So let's take it back and kind of reset back to what Ronnie was talking about at the start of his presentation. This case where your kind of success or business goal, whatever that long-term objective is, if your key metric is very clearly your business goal and is measurable in the time frame of an experiment, then great. You can run well-powered, well-designed tests on that key metric, and from there build up your library of learnings. But of course, as Ronnie pointed out, that isn't often the case. Reality is messier. Often your measurable goals are not one-to-one with your business goals. And so what we have to do instead, and what most companies tend to do, is build implicit models, or sometimes explicit models, and I'll talk about that a bit, about how your metrics relate to your long-term objectives. In this talk, I'm going to talk about how we can think about these models and some examples of how we can formalize them, which I think is a few different ways to think about it, but at the end of the day, kind of choose what works best for your organization. I'll start with a simple example of having multiple surrogate metrics, different ways to kind of capture in the short term things that relate to your long-term goals. Then I'll talk about proxy metrics or an individual surrogate metric or a estimated overall evaluation criteria, something that Ronnie also touched on. Work through an example of a shipping criteria that I've seen in the past, and then talk about a fun topic, preference elicitation, and a game you can kind of play in your org to think about how multiple metrics should relate to your decision-making process. So let's start with a simple example. Much like the search engine case that Ronnie was talking about, nowadays AI companies building LLM chatbots have a lot of the same problems in making their chatbots better and improving the experience for users. So it's great that all these companies are spending a ton of time investing in the core models, which are honestly amazing. But at the end of the day, they have to take these and provide a product that is useful to consumers. And that is what they're trying to do with, maybe on the consumer side or sometimes on the enterprise side as well with chatbots. Think your, ChatGPT, your Claude, so on and so forth. The goal from the company's perspective is something related to kind of lifetime value, being able to provide a lot of value to their customers that they can take advantage of, and that they can capture some of that value that's being delivered to customers for the company's interests. Now, to get there, you probably need something like a user finding the chatbot to be useful and worth paying for. And it would help if it was across many domains, not just your work, but also maybe some stuff in your personal life and organization, cooking, etc., so planning trips, so on and so forth. So how do you go about designing that right metric? Like Ronnie said, something simple like a number of queries doesn't quite work because these can be increased by negative experiences. If you've ever tried to get a chatbot to give you an answer that's useful and it's not quite working right, you're spending a lot of time typing in a lot of queries and you're actually having a worse experience, but it looks like you're more engaged and more active. So you could either run a 6-month experiment, capture long-run retention and revenue, but in reality, that's not feasible in many cases. So instead, what these companies do, and this is what we're seeing, being pretty common across the AI companies that use GrowthBook and across the experimentation space, and they're tracking other metrics like the number of days active, the range of topics that are being prompted upon, and then, like Ronnie was talking about, this number of distinct sessions is super important, that repeat value across domains. And so then they have this mental model, probably explicit model as well, about how these two inputs channel towards the user finding the chatbot useful and worth paying for. So they're going to look at the frequency of usage and try to operationalize that the right way. They're going to look at users' willingness to pay now as a very strong metric of them being willing to pay in the long run. And then also some metrics around how good the chatbot responses are. Again, like Ronnie was saying in the booking example, something like the user satisfaction score that a booking platform might use. So we can operationalize this as the number of distinct chatbot sessions, maybe short-term subscriptions, and the number of times maybe responses are copied out of a chatbot into another platform. But the problem with having all these metrics in this model is that just throwing them all into your results can complicate the picture. You can get something that looks like this, where some are flat or vaguely negative, some are stat sig negative, and some are stat sig positive. And then the question becomes, how do you go from this to a decision? How do you go from this to learning whether this experiment was successful or not? I'm going to walk through a few examples and show you some take-home advice about how you can kind of evaluate that model yourself in your business. So the first is something like a proxy metric or a estimated surrogate metric. Ronnie was discussing this also in his talk. It's the idea that you have a single overall evaluation criteria, a single metric that is targeted at your long-term goal. It's estimated from observational data where you can measure that main goal. So for that LLM chatbot company, they want to measure long-term revenue and they want to measure the long-term value the customer is receiving from the product. What they can do in that observational sample, they can do some data analysis and they can look at the relationship between query sessions, shares of chatbot results, the number of days active, and so on, and estimate how those predict that lifetime value. Then you can experiment on that estimated lifetime value. This is a similar problem that Airbnb has. They want to measure long-term booking retention. They don't want their experiments just to drive up short-term bookings that then get canceled. So they can build a model of what happens when a user makes a booking, the probability that that is retained, and the value of that retention, and then experiment directly on that. So you have something like the following as your kind of model, where you have some ground truth outcome of interest. So this here will be your key business goal that's measurable over the long term. And then you can use an observational sample to build that proxy metric. And then in an experiment case, you can use the lift on that proxy metric to make your decisions. But because this pathway isn't exactly what you're interested in, which is how your product leads to long-term goals, models can drift from ground truth and need regular validation. There's a great blog post on Medium by a Meta core data science team about how to do this in practice, a good framework for evaluating the model that you're using to build this overall evaluation criteria. Maybe a simpler model to build are shipping criteria. Instead of building an explicit overall evaluation criteria that's a numerical number, perhaps you can come up with a series of decision steps that help you ship in all conditions. So several teams at Twitter, while I worked there, were using shipping criteria to make decisions on top of experiments. The example maybe of the Twitter timeline team, whose goal was to provide value in the timeline, get users to get in value out of what they're seeing at the top of their feed as they scroll through their feed and so on. For the company, daily active users was important as it was a primarily ad-driven business, but they didn't, as Ronnie said, just want to turn up the ad knob. You want to make sure that people are using the product repeatedly and over time to see that they're getting value out of it in a wide variety of applications. So if DAU is up in stat sig, then ship. If DAU is negative, then roll it back. If maybe DAU is positive and not stat sig, then in those situations, these teams agreed that they could use some strong signals on leading indicators, such as tweets created, likes, and so on and so forth, and then ship in those conditions. Otherwise, it would go to an experiment review. In any other situation with murky results, roll back. And so the question here becomes, if you take Ronnie's advice, maybe from the first panel, there'd be a few more cases where you wouldn't be willing to ship, but nonetheless, you want to make sure that you have this criteria clearly laid out. That's because it can enable independent decision making by product teams without requiring the kind of either mathiness of a estimated overall evaluation criteria or without the legwork of having to estimate a model using a large amount of data that you might not have. It allows you to use simple rules that map to business logic, but these still need to be revisited regularly, just like models of estimated proxy metrics, because they can evolve over time. Lastly, I'm going to talk about one fun kind of approach that you can take with your team. I think this is fun, and I think every team should at least think about this as a way to think about what their trade-offs are between their multiple surrogate metrics, and that's kind of eliciting the preferences of the key decision makers and folks with a lot of kind of background knowledge at your company. So what if instead of coming up with ad hoc rules or sending every murky experiment to review, we could just know in this instance, what would our decision makers or the people who kind of encode the business trade-offs that we face, what would they do in those situations? And this is based off of some work coming primarily out of Meta, but has since been used by a lot of different folks. It requires you to basically play the following game, which is which of these two experiments would I prefer to ship? In this situation, we've got two experiments, one here at the top, one here at the bottom, with a set of results on DAU, daily active users, and revenue. In the first instance, DAU is up 3%, and revenue is up 4%. In the second instance, DAU is up 4%, and revenue is up 4%. If you ask decision makers at your company which of these two they would ship, it's pretty straightforward. They would pick the second one. It's better on DAU, and it's the same on revenue. But then you ask them, well, what would you do in this situation? Here, DAU is now no longer up 3, but up 1%, and it's not stat sig. And revenue is, but revenue has gone up from a 4% lift to a 7% lift. So in this situation, which of these two versions of your experiment would your decision makers ship? In these cases, you get to learn what is the trade-off between these metrics that you're willing to accept when shipping metrics. So this allows you basically to encode decision maker knowledge at your company and their preferences, and you can build very specific kind of nonlinear shipping criteria just based on these pairwise comparisons of experiment results. And it's kind of fun to think outside of the context of an individual experiment and the biases that come with evaluating an individual experiment. What are your actual trade-offs? It means that when you go into a decision meeting, you kind of have at your side what you think are the real trade-offs between your key metrics, and you're not going to be subject to the biases in those meetings of, well, actually, I really like this team, so I'm willing to accept a little bit less of a clear lift on DAU. So the practical advice is pretty simple at the end of the day. It's write down your long-term goal and write down what you can measure, and then figure out the best surrogate metrics from the set that you can measure and how those relate to your long-term goals. And then the question is, how do you combine these metrics to best predict your long-term goal? And then you have to regularly revisit this logic because you probably were going to be wrong the first time, and maybe things will drift over time. The target maybe because you can measure the target, it can lead to you drifting away from your end goal. So just regularly revisit this logic. And don't worry about over formalizing or complicating it. But I also don't think you should just chuck a bunch of metrics into an experiment. Think critically about what you would do if those metrics told different stories about whether you should ship or not. In this process, you can provide some structure which leverages your domain expertise and it'll allow your program to scale because people can make decisions independently, and it helps guard against biases because you're kind of upfront stating how these many metrics should relate to your long-term business goal. Great. Well, that's all I have for now. I'm going to hand it over
Yeah.
to Ashley for the raffle.
Yeah, Luke, actually just keep presenting. I ran into a little technical difficulty. I was hoping we would have a fun little app to do the raffle, but that didn't work out. So we're going to do something a little more manual here. So just give me 1 sec. Here we go. Okay, so we're going to randomly pick 3 different attendees from the list. And the first one is Sofia Ivanova. Congratulations, Sophia. Right. And what we're doing right now is we're raffling off 3 tickets to Ronnie's class. So here we go with the second one. And the winner is Vestimir Markov. And then last but not least, the winner is Jose Canto. All right, so you three winners, we'll be following up with you after the webinar. And with that, Luke, we can move on to the.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just scoot down to the end here where we've got the Q&A. Great. Thanks everybody for your questions. We've got a few that have been upvoted quite a bit at the top. So I think we can go ahead and kick it off there. I mean, maybe Ronny, this is a great one for you to start with. What would you say about how to promote a culture that embraces the ideas behind not shipping flat? Seems much of what's behind shipping flat would be political in nature.
Yep, great question. I think what I've shared with you today is, sort of the mechanism for how to convince the organization that they should not ship flap. So realize that most ideas fail, right? That table that shows you that the median organization has a success rate of about 10 to 15%. And so if you believe that, then your probability of making errors is high, and therefore you should not be shipping on flat. And remember the 4 reasons I went to? Each one had sort of a reason. We're complicating the code base. Why would we ship something that's not helping users, right? Move the org from something that celebrates the, code complete to something that celebrates we are helping users. The real key reason we're removing the key metrics.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I don't have a lot to add. I think we should move on. There's a lot of great questions here. Just on Alejandro's question, can we get the Meta blog link, please? Yeah, I will drop it in the Zoom chat soon, and we'll also be sending out my slides, which have the link in it after the webinar. When would you prefer Bayesian over Frequentist A/B testing? I'll kick us off, and then I also would love to hear your thoughts, Ronny, on this.
Okay.
Personally, I think that the Frequentist mode of making it really clear kind of what your preferences are around a false positive rate and kind of sticking to that paradigm makes the most sense to me. But I also understand how if you had, say, strong prior information, or you're in the case where maybe it's easier just to talk about probabilities and the Bayesian engine kind of gives you those simple numbers, you would prefer a Bayesian engine. At the end of the day, if you're not using an engine with very strong priors in it, they're going to come out to have very similar results. So this kind of isn't a critical question in my mind. The critical question is, what are your standards for shipping in either of those situations? And that's kind of what we've been talking about today. But Ronny, I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah. So first of all, the model that the Bayesian approach does and that the frequentist approach does are very different. And that's important to realize it. The frequentist approach says, look, follow this process. And if you follow the process, we guarantee that you will have few what are called type 1 errors, right? Few times where we will declare something to be stat sig when we should not have declared it. The Bayesian approach works the opposite. It says, tell me where we are today. Tell me your prior distribution, and I'll tell you how to update it. But if the prior is wrong, nothing is guaranteed, right? So think about this. One approach tells you under these conditions, I will give you some guarantee. The Bayesian approach says, if you are correct, then I'll tell you how to update it. But if you're wrong, all bets are off. And I believe in many organizations, the frequentist approach is therefore the better approach. That does not mean that there's no room for Bayesian. In fact, there's a lot of room for Bayesian when you are sure about the prior. If you have a lot of data, if you have a lot of good understanding, say in manufacturing, we can build really good models of what's going on. And therefore, we can run experiments with less data. But in a world where our success rate is so low, it tells us we don't have good priors. And so when you start to use non-informative Bayesian priors, you end up effectively doing the same thing as a frequentist approach, and therefore I prefer the guarantee. I put a link in the chat for those that want to see it. It's a nice article by Krushke and he talks about this point of sort of the guarantee, and there's a nice summary there, which I like. Again, both are appropriate, but they're just in different scenarios. I find that in many of the online scenarios that we're working at, we are so far from having a great model that we can predict what's going on, that the frequentist approach is more appropriate for most organizations.
Great. Next question here. I tried a complex setup with Claude Code. Oh, and it performed well in analyzing post-campaign evaluation. How do you see experimentation expertise evolving with AI? Ron, you want to take this? I'm happy to take it as well.
Why don't you start?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Um, I'm not sure what you mean by complex setup. That could mean a lot of different things. But I think if the quality of writing, such as that Ronnie has done and has been scraped by these LLMs, is of high quality, then I think the LLM could do a good job of evaluating those results. But of course, that's kind of the key, is that they're based on what is publicly available and the knowledge that we're kind of building off of those. And it won't answer questions like, which of these metrics to you is more important. It may give advice that assumes that metric A is important because it sounds like a metric that in the English language has been used to seem as important. So I think it can be a really powerful tool, but it's also a kind of garbage in, garbage out situation. You want to make sure that you've already picked the right metrics to feed into it to give you that analysis. And I think that the hard work is then up front, not at that last step at the analysis stage. I also think the stakes here are sufficiently high if it is a strong enough, if it is a large enough kind of engineering lift to build this feature you're interested in shipping, that you shouldn't just kind of let somebody else make the decision for you. This is kind of one of the key ways that as building becomes cheaper and cheaper, we still make sure we're shipping things that are moving us in the right direction. You can make a PR really cheaply now, but you still want to make sure you're making the right decision. So the hard work is in building the metrics and setup. And then if that is in place, then the analysis and expertise reading of it might be kind of less important and could be done by hopefully anybody, right? Yeah, Ronnie, curious what your thoughts are here.
Well, I'm trying to interpret the question. I interpret it a little bit different, that there was some feature that they built with Claude in this complex setup and it sort of performed well in an experiment.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But I don't know what the what Ahmed El Ashri said. I like you, I'm aligned with the fact that, LLMs help us interpret the results. LLM can also suggest hypotheses to test out. And I actually talk about this in my class about areas and prompts and things that have worked well in practice. We're also talking about sort of my interpretation, which is if you generated some code using Vibe or whatever, how to test that. And I think it's a great area and it's evolving fast. And experimentation is a good complement to that, sort of having code generated and then being evaluated in an experimental setup. You still need to come up with the key metrics. Like that OEC is such a hard problem that we need the sort of the human background and the understanding and to work on it a lot. And I think LLMs are not there yet, but I think the jury's out. I mean, I think they're certainly helping in many, many areas. And I think it's a great combination.
Yeah, I think that is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. And the making ideas cheaper and cheaper to execute only increases the value of having a well-oiled experimentation machine, just like it increases the value of having really good like CI tooling. You don't want your builds to fail on some vibe-coded new feature, and you certainly don't want some new vibe-coded feature just because it was easy to build to degrade the user experience. And so it actually increases the value of experimentation. I know that biases, I work for an experimentation platform, but I think it increases the value of experimentation. You want to make sure those ideas are actually delivering value now that they've become cheaper to build.
Yeah,
And
just to add to that,
yeah.
one more thing. The other piece of it that we're doing a lot at GrowthBook is just helping to accelerate the whole process of doing the testing itself, from everything from hypothesis, kind of fine tuning to analyzing past results to integrating with the coding IDEs and AI to build the feature once you've come up with the idea. And so I think you're going to see, the ability to test get easier and easier, as well as the fact that you're able to actually build the feature easier. It's now going to be easier and easier to actually run the test too.
The kind of related question is at the top here, which is if most of the time you don't see experiments move metrics, why not do big, bold bets like a totally new landing page? I think that's a great question. I I think the main reason not to is that there's a cost associated with experimentation, and the chief cost is building the thing that you want to experiment on. And if there is a bold new landing page that takes months and months to build, and you don't believe it has a good chance of panning out, then why would you build it? If you believe there's a chance, then maybe taking big swings is definitely worth it. And the other flip side of that is often we can see small changes having big impacts. But yeah, Ronnie, I want to hear your thoughts here as well.
I used to be sort of I'm still in the camp that says, look, some portion of the time you should try to make big jumps and radical changes. But I think it's a question of allocation. I think most of the time you should do what's called OFAT, one factor at a time. And the reason is the following. You make a big change, it's got, 13 changes lumped together, and then the result comes out and it's flat or down. And then people come to the data science team and say, okay, why is it flattened down? And then we say, okay, now let's run OFAT. Let's run several individual changes to see what can they explain. So I think it's very, very typical. Remember, if the probability of a success is so low, 10, 20%, then why would lumping 20 ideas that each have 20% turn out to be positive? No, you're likely to be zero at the end or very small. And so the problem is always that what you learn from it. The goal in an experiment is that even when it fails to move the key metrics that you move, there is learning from it. And when you do 13 changes together, there is no learning. All you know is that, this mishmash of ideas together failed. And then you see people saying, okay, let's do the right thing and try to componentize it and test those smaller components to understand which are positive and which are negative. I have a whole section of this in the advanced class that I talk to and give examples, but it is true. I can just give you the data. Most of the big changes that we see out there, they fail to deliver. It sounds good. We'll just completely redesign the homepage. And then you realize that when you do the redesign, you're worse. What do you do? You already invested 6 months. And then it turns out to be this effort to figure out, okay, which of the changes that we made is actually made it worse.
I'm going to ask you to follow up with this next question, which is, what are the best A/B testing strategies to roll out a major redesign or a completely new design? If you are in that situation, how could you actually do like one factor at a time? Like what's the way
So I mentioned that this is a good thing. You want to say, I want to do a redesign and I'm going to invest in it. And this is where we want to end up. And then you ask yourself, okay, so we want to go from point A to point B. What are the intermediate points that we can go to that will allow us to learn about whether the direction is correct? So it may not be just a single factor, but it's a small number of things that you change, and then you get the data. And then you realize, oh, I need to adjust my intuition. And so that happened to me multiple times where I've convinced groups to take their goal, but let's try to, instead of working on it for 6 months, let's work on it on something for 2 months. That's a major feature in that eventual release and see if that's useful or not. And when you get a negative, people adjust their intuition. Or even when you get a flat, people start to adjust their intuition and say, maybe it's not as good idea as we thought. And that's the reality of experimentation. It's very, very humbling. And it's a beautiful culture to build where people talk about not my idea is great, but let's try my idea because I know there's a 80% chance it's not going to work out. But if it does work out, then we validated our knowledge and understanding. And that's how you move.
I think we have one other question kind of related to that as well that has a lot of upvotes, and I want to chime in a little bit before throwing it to you, Ronnie. I know you kind of covered this a little bit in your talk, but the question is, here in my company, when the result is flat, we believe shipping the variant wouldn't cause any harm. Would you suggest not recommending the variant? I would say there's two kind of components to this question. One is flat doesn't mean it won't cause any harm. In fact, if it's like really flat, there's maybe a 50% chance it will cause harm. So that's something that you have to accept is the uncertainty. If flat means to you, you have a well estimated zero and you're precise that your lift is very close to zero, something like that, then it becomes a question of the cost of the thing that you're rolling out. It's all about the cost. Many of the examples Ronnie was talking
Well,
about.
it's not just, it's important. It's not the cost of the rollout, it's the cost
Yeah,
of the maintenance.
that's
Because
right.
whenever you ship new features, there's all this new code that goes in.
That's right.
And if you ship a lot of flat, by the end of the year, you're like, oh my God, we didn't move the metric, but we shipped another 100,000 lines of code.
That's right. It's this path dependence you're put on. Now you have to maintain it. And then you're going to start to build on this idea and spend time iterating on this idea that actually was not. So that's kind of implicit in a lot of Ronnie's slides. And at the end of that talk, we're like, oh, this is a canvas for future innovation. You don't want to start with a canvas that's not helpful at all. It's just going to lead you to make these, small kind of investments that are going to maybe even continue to be negative or be a kind of drain on your time. Um, let's see, what's a good question to pivot to here? I think I'd like to kind of jump to this one here. What's your philosophy on what to test and what not to test? What percentage of test to non-test has been your average? I'm curious, Ronnie, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this question.
Well, for me, it's easy. It's test everything.
Yeah,
That's the goal. Now, there are things that are really hard to test, and there's a trade-off there. Are we going to ship something without testing it? And yes, at Bing, I would say it was around 80 to 90% of all changes that were tested. But, some things like when you upgrade the OS, it was like, okay, we're going to have to do this. And it's not worth the effort of building sort of all these machines with this OS and these machines with the other OS and running an A/B test. And then it's funny that we've done some of those, and it turns out that because the machines with the new OS had a slightly different hardware, that's what we discovered, that the hardware is better or worse. So I think the ideal should be test everything. Every new feature should be in some experiment. It doesn't mean that has to be in a single experiment. Sometimes you say, we have all these, 6 bug fixes. Let's just put them together in one test to make sure we're not degrading a key metric, right? So the goal is, we're fixing a bunch of bugs. We want non-inferiority. That's reasonable, but it should be part of a test because it's very easy for somebody to introduce a bug that you didn't think about that hurts revenue by 5%.
yeah. I think, yeah, just to add one thing onto that, the goal of a platform like GrowthBook is to reduce the cost of experimenting as much as possible so that testing can be ubiquitous.
Right.
And that should kind of be the goal of your experimentation program as well.
Absolutely. I agree
Yeah.
that sort of this incremental cost of running an experiment, the marginal cost,
Yeah.
you should drive it down to zero. And we've done that in multiple organizations where like editors at MSN could test headlines. There was no coding involved. Their system allowed them to give multiple headlines and the experiment was set up automatically in the background. That's the beauty of things, right? For engineering, you want to be able to say this piece of code will run as an experiment. For configuration files, you want to say, I'm changing this configuration parameter for 3 to 5. It's an experiment and then no coding is required. That's the ideal.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're at time here. I want to thank you all for coming. Thanks for the great questions too. There's a few, a little bit further down the tree that are kind of spicier. Sorry we didn't get to some of those. But thank you all for attending so much. Thanks, Ronnie, from my co-host, and Ashley for organizing. Thanks you all. To you all. We'll be reaching out to the 3 of you that won the raffle. And Ashley, any last words?
Yeah, we will be sending out the recording to everyone. So
Great. Yeah. And we'll include, I know some of you asked about some links that were in my slide deck. We'll be sure to include that information as well in a follow-up email.
Thank you all.
thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.